There's a photograph of me very few people have ever seen in person. Somehow I finagled a digital copy, but I have no idea where the actual photo is. Maybe it's sitting sunken with the sediment of a cardboard box in someone's attic. In it, my mom is camped out in front of an incubator, hunched over in a prayer huddle, holding a vigil for a newborn me. I had just survived a surgical procedure to repair a hole accidentally punched in my esophagus during delivery. And the backstory of how my family came to be isn't any less intense. My grandfather shotgun punked my gramps into marrying my grandmother. Their enamored tryst soon became an embittered nightmare. My grandfather Mario was from the old school proletariat world and had a cluster of egregious character flaws that stemmed from his macho chauvinist background. His sins included drinking, gambling, and even more dastardly, he would raise a hand to anyone, male or female, without hesitation. Hardship was nothing new for Mario. His parents died when he was only 12, and before too much longer, he made his way with the Merchant Marines, seeking the promise of milk and honey by way of New York City. His ground zero was the Lower East Side, where he learned to speak English while washing dishes at a restaurant there. Accompanied by only his cousin, who was more like a niece, he would keep an eye on her while they decompressed from immigrant life at the bar after work. He would allow would-be suitors to buy him beers, while he chaperoned them doing what they could to chat up my cousin Jana, who was quite the dame in her day. After getting his money up as a waiter, Gramps moved to Brooklyn, where he met his first and only wife, who would someday be my grandmother. She was from the same part of northern Italy as him, and the seeds of romance were almost immediately sown. Italy changed sides during World War I after refusing to fight alongside Austria-Hungary. That rendered her father, a brutish man who was not one to be trifled with, onto service of both the Axis and the Allies during World War I. Upon learning of Mario's entanglement with his daughter, he was decidedly displeased. My grandparents had been forced to marry under the threat of violence by the man who I would come to know as my great-grandfather. He was a stern soul with an unflinching posture that would not budge an inch for the foibles of human nature. He let it be known to Mario that he could marry his daughter or perhaps find himself in dire straits. Their forced union had repercussions that sent shockwaves through both mine and my mother's lifetime. It was the good old days, back when she was a kid, when the purchasing power of money could afford an immigrant family the luxury of having the father go to work and the mother stay home to raise the child. That set the stage for an affair that my grandmother was to have with a man named Mark, who was a Holocaust survivor from Germany. And this was the premise for revenge that she would try to exact upon him later. On the other side of my family, on my father's side, they were a bit more stable, but they were also just as dysfunctional. My father's parents had divorced through lack of compatibility, and his father had come back traumatized from World War II. So that put him in a place of needing a father. So my grandmother married her boss at an engineering firm, essentially marrying out of working class life, and settled into a luxury home in the suburb of Queens called Malba, with my father taking his new stepfather's surname. So they were a bit more stuffy around the edges, but both sides were equally generous and high-spirited. My mother and father met during the early stages of their starry-eyed seeker years. It was the age of lava lamp-lit living rooms, rank with infestations of impenetrable clouds of incense. If you were hip, your coffee tables were filled with crystals and stones, surrounded by an altar of prayer candles of your favorite guru or saint. The walls bled tapestries with radial waves of mandalas, colored in every shade of sublime tone you could only dream of with the help of psychedelic tutoring. My folks would hang around like the macrame so common to the scene, as the idealism of their 20s aligned them on a path with new horizons, complements of the New Age culture in New York City during the mid-70s. That ethereal chapter of life found them transiting themes that took them to the outer limits of spirituality, the occult, and transcendental meditation. They were introduced at a meditation group whose intent was to use patchouli oil as a substitute for personal hygiene, as well as study the teachings of the renowned psychic and clairvoyant Edgar Cayce. The group was led by a portly woman named Marlene, who was also an advisor to John Lennon and Yoko Ono. She had the air of a Mother Goose mystic and would sport tinted glasses that clashed with a gigantic mint mouthwash blue nightgown that could double as a onesie for Jabba the Hutt. She was a prominent fixture in my parents' inner circle and presided over the equivalent of a New Age baptism in my grandparents' backyard when I was a baby. Marlene also had a hand in convincing my parents to bequeath me as my given name, Ephraim, something that used to make me wince every year on the first day of school as a kid when the teacher would start class with a roll call. Their groovy union, wrought in the counterculture scene, brought me into the world as the decade was coming to a close. I was born on a Monday, and perhaps the nurse attending to me who accidentally punctured a hole in my esophagus was still hungover after a weekend binge at Studio 54. The infamous club had managed to stay open in spite of the owners being indicted of fraud that very same month, so people like the hardworking Sisters of Mercy could have a place to inhale key bumps of cocaine while wiggling in their disco outfits to celebrated porn star anthems like More, More, More. My own story began with a crash course in hard knocks, as my introduction to life was slippery and tenuous. I slid into the world toward the tail end of Generation X, just over halfway through 1979 in New York City. While cleaning an excess of phlegm from my throat with a plastic tube, the attending nurse inadvertently punctured a fateful hole in my nascent newborn esophagus. The doctor, to whom I owe my bizarre track through life, took a risk against the stability of his career, using decisive snap judgment to operate on me in spite of the fact that he was on a break. And that could have completely sunk his battleship in a court of law. But fortunately for my aspiring storytelling prowess, fate prevailed on my side. My mother christened me with the name of Ephraim Mark, but the scandalous origin story was known throughout the corners of my family. My name, as far as my grandmother's concerned, should have simply been Mark. She intended that name to function as a weapon of personal vendetta against a husband who had been raising a hand to her for years. And her husband would never ever call me by that name, not even once, not even to the day he died, over 90 years old, 14 years to the day after his wife passed away. That's the kind of family I come from, and that's the kind of century I was born into. This is where part one of my life story begins, in a hospital near Harlem, the summer of 1979, with a medical bill my parents refused to name, and a name that was an act of war. We left the city shortly thereafter to live in the countryside of West Virginia. Getting back to the land, although idealistic, proved not to be enough to sustain the connection. They were as similar as a washer and dryer, ultimately unable to work out the kinks on how to function successfully together as a unit. Barely a year after we started our new life, the idealized glow of a cleaner, more innocent life closer to God and country became a burnout light bulb of a relationship. In the end, irreconcilable differences drove their paths of hopes and dreams in opposing directions. My dad and I absconded to live in the folds of down home Huntington, West Virginia. That's how the early 80s found me, like a sizable flock of my Gen X peers. As a child of the microwave American dream in a single-parent household, I sauntered through the 80s until my dad remarried again, casting me as the role of delinquent stepson for his new wife during the 90s. Friends were the pain relief of my new nuisance-laden life. I had my rite of passage era circa 1994 and stepped into the world as a young man by way of my first girlfriend the following year. My coming-of-age high school sweetheart story could have been the rough draft for an American Pie forerunner, as I boldly went where at least a handful of other men had gone before. Even after escaping high school in 1997, I continued onward with my quest to be the eternal dude, always living for the moment and never giving much thought till tomorrow. Eventually, I had to hang up my spurs, at least for a couple years, while learning to be a more responsible member of society. But then I got caught in a whirlwind of ominous timing one week in July of 2006, as I happened upon what seemed like a chance text chat with a friend from the 90s. I told him to come with me to Spain. He said he wasn't going to make it there. At the end of the week, I got a call from a mutual friend saying that he was found dead, a victim of taking his own life. That unexpected loss spurred me on to try my hand at expat life abroad in Spain, taking a one-way ticket to Barcelona from New York City in September of 2006. And that's how it all started. That's my origin story of how I ended up in Costa Rica at 31 years old, where my life was truly meant to begin.